The storm had rolled in overnight, the kind that swallowed highways and blurred horizons until even the barns looked like ghosts. By morning, the Carter family was up early, coffee brewing, generator humming, the world outside buried under drifts taller than the porch rail. It was Hannah, the youngest, who noticed it first.
Dad, was that there yesterday?
At the far edge of the property, where the fence sagged under years of winter abuse, stood a snowman. Not a cheerful one. No carrot nose, no scarf, no playful grin. It was tall, wrong-proportioned, and made of crusted, wind-packed snow. 2 shards of dark wood jutted where eyes should be. Its stick arms pointed down stiffly, like it had been caught mid-march. Frank Carter squinted through the frost on the dining room window. "No," he said, "it wasn't." They assumed it was a neighbor kid playing a prank, though no neighbors lived close enough to walk here through a blizzard. Still, they brushed it off. People made odd choices when winter locked them in. But Hannah kept glancing outside, chewing her sleeve, frowning every time the wind shifted. The snowman looked angled, tilted slightly toward the house, as if it listening. By noon, the storm clouds had moved east, leaving the air painfully bright. Sun hit the snowman's face, and the dark wooden eyes almost gleamed back. That was when Martha Carter whispered, "Frank, it looks like it's facing us." He told her it was just the light, but even he hesitated. Something about the shape, the posture, too human and not human at all. That night, after the kids went to bed, the generator lights flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. Frank stepped onto the porch to check the cables, breath rising like steam. The yard was silent. But at the fence line, the snowman stood exactly as before, except he couldn't shake the feeling it had shifted. An inch, maybe 2. He closed the door fast, locking it out of habit. By morning, the habit would no longer matter. The next morning, the world outside looked untouched, smooth as plaster, except for one detail that stopped Martha mid-step. The snowman was closer. Not just a little. It now stood halfway between the fence and the porch, planted firmly in the middle of the yard like it had claimed territory overnight. Its wooden eyes were still staring straight ahead, but from this distance, the tilt of its head felt unmistakable, almost curious. Frank insisted it had to be drifting snow or the wind knocking it over and someone rebuilding it, though he couldn't name who. The nearest neighbor lived miles down the county road, and nobody in their right mind would walk through knee-high drifts just to rearrange a snowman on someone else's property. Hannah pressed her face to the window. "Dad, there are no footprints." She was right. The ground around the snowman was pristine. No tracks, no disturbance, no sign that anything or anyone had crossed the yard. After breakfast, Frank bundled up and stepped outside. The cold bit at his face as he approached the figure. Up close, the snow seemed dense, too tightly packed like ice sculpted rather than rolled by hand. The arms weren't sticks at all, but thin dark branches polished smooth, almost unnaturally straight. He circled it once, uneasy, before heading back inside. By late afternoon, the wind had settled. Light filtered through the windows in long amber stripes. That was when Hannah gasped again. "It moved!" Dad didn't want to look, but he did. The snowman had turned, just slightly. Now it faced the house directly. That evening, the family gathered in the living room, trying to distract themselves with an old movie. But every so often, one of them glanced toward the window, even with the curtains drawn. It felt like something was out there, waiting, listening to the walls breathe. Before bed, Martha went to lock the back door. The knob was cold, colder than the air should have been inside. For a moment, she thought she heard something outside, a soft, slow crunch like weight settling into snow. She held her breath. Silence. Maybe it was her imagination. Maybe it was the wind. But when she finally turned away from the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that the snow outside wasn't done shifting. Not yet. By the third morning, the cold had a sharper bite, the kind that settled into bones and made old houses creak like they were exhaling in pain. Martha opened the curtains, expecting to see the same eerie sight as yesterday. But there were two. A second snowman stood a few yards behind the first, shorter, narrower, its head shaped unevenly, as if whoever made it had struggled to form it. The first still faced the house, unblinking. The new one tilted slightly to the side, like it was studying something. Frank swore under his breath. This is someone's idea of a joke. But nobody was laughing. The second snowman was different in a way that made Martha's stomach knot. Its face wasn't just two holes in a crooked line. It had definition. Snow pressed inward to form cheekbones, a chin, even the faint shadow of a mouth. A real face struggling to emerge through frozen layers. Hannah whispered, "It looks like Mr. Turner." Mr. Turner, the man who vanished last month while driving home along Old Ridge Road. Police had found his abandoned truck, door wide open, engine running. No footprints, no struggle, just gone. Frank snapped gently, "It's just a shape, honey." But he didn't sound convinced. Later that afternoon, when the wind died down and the world grew glassy still, Martha ventured onto the porch to shake off a rug. Her breath caught. The second snowman's features looked even more defined now. The curve of the jaw, the slight droop of the left eye. She remembered that about Mr. Turner, an old injury from a baseball accident. She backed toward the door. As the sun sank behind the pines, the yard fell into blue shadow. That was when they heard it. 3 distinct thumps against the side of the house. Not loud, not frantic, slow, deliberate. Frank grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The beam slid across snowdrifts and the old truck and stopped on the Snowmen. They were closer. Not much, maybe 2 feet, but enough to make his throat tighten. He didn't linger. He rushed back inside, bolting the door behind him. No one slept well that night. The wind didn't howl, the house didn't settle. The world outside was absolutely still, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to move next.
By morning, the sky had cleared into a pale, brittle blue, the kind that made every shadow look sharper than it should. Martha was the first downstairs, wrapping herself in a blanket and brewing coffee strong enough to mask her unease. She tried not to look out the window. Tried, until the smell of the coffee made her glance up. Both snowmen stood in the same spot as last night, but something about them that changed again. The first one, the tall, wrong-proportioned figure, seemed to have shoulders now, defined under a crust of ice. The second snowman's face had sharpened even further. She didn't dare stare too long. Frank came down with the local paper tucked under his arm, rushing past her toward the table. But as he opened it, a photo on the front page caught Martha's eye. A headline ran across the top. "Search continues for missing county resident." Under it, a picture of a middle-aged man with a gaunt face, deep-set eyes, and a faded scar along his right cheekbone. Her heart dropped. It was the same face the second snowman was forming. She reached over and touched the photo with trembling fingers. Frank looked from the picture to the window, then back again. His jaw clenched. "This is impossible. Look at the angle of the scar. It's the same." Hannah wandered in, still half asleep. When she saw the picture, she didn't need explanations. Her eyes snapped to the yard, widening. "They're copying people," she whispered. Frank folded the newspaper too hard, the sound a sharp crack in the quiet kitchen. "Enough, we're calling the sheriff again." But the sheriff had already dismissed them once, chalking the snowman up to wind, kids, or overactive imaginations. When Frank called, the response was predictably tired. "Unless the snowmen are committing a crime, I don't see much to investigate." Frank hung up without answering. By afternoon, the house felt colder, even with the heat running. No one went outside. No one dared. At one point, Martha caught herself staring at the window for so long her eyes watered. That evening, the generator lights flickered again. Just a flutter, but enough to make everyone freeze. As they gathered in the living room, an uneasy silence settled over them. Then a dull thump sounded somewhere outside, followed by another. Frank moved toward the window, but stopped before pulling back the curtain. He didn't need to. He already knew the snowman would be closer.
The next morning arrived gray and soundless, as if the world outside had been wrapped in wool. Martha woke to the distant groan of the house settling, but something about the pitch of it made her sit up fast, heart thudding. She went to the window. A third snowman stood near the old shed. This one was smaller than the others, but its posture was unmistakably human. Head slightly bowed, shoulders forward, like it was listening at a door. Its face wasn't fully shaped yet, but the features were forming faster than the previous ones, as if whatever was beneath the snow had learned from its earlier attempts. Martha's breath fogged the glass. Frank joined her a moment later, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His expression hardened when he saw the newcomer. "They're getting bolder," he muttered. "Or closer," Martha whispered. When Hannah came downstairs, she refused to look out the window. "I heard something last night. Someone walking. Not fast, just heavy, like they weren't sure how to move." Frank exchanged a glance with Martha. By noon, the clouds parted for a brief, thin strip of sunlight, and that's when they noticed something that made their skin crawl. On the back porch, along the wooden boards, were wet marks. Irregular, slushy patches. Not footprints, not quite handprints, but places where compacted snow had been pressed and then melted. As if a snow-covered shape had leaned there, as if it had watched them through the window. Frank grabbed his boots and stomped outside despite Martha's protests. He circled the porch, checking for tracks, for drips, for anything normal he could cling to. The yard was disturbed only near the snowmen, 3 sets of shallow indentations in the snow around them. Not prints, more like the ground had compacted under shifting weight. Inside, Hannah sat on the stairs hugging her knees. "Mom, the third one looks like Mrs. Daly." Mrs. Daly, the woman who vanished 2 weeks ago on her way to pick up feed from the store. The search party had found her truck door open, groceries spilled across the snow. No tracks, no struggle. Martha felt a cold pressure in her chest. By late afternoon, the generator flickered again, longer this time. Lights dimmed, the TV cut off. A hush fell over the house. Outside, the wind stopped completely. Frank went to shut the curtains and froze. The first snowman had turned. So had the second. So had the third. All three faced the house directly now, aligned in a perfect row, their shadows stretching toward the porch like reaching arms. No one spoke for the rest of the evening. Even after the light steadied, even after the house warmed again, a thick dread clung to every corner. Because now the snowmen weren't just closer. They were watching. That night, no one slept. The air inside the house felt tight, heavy, like it carried a pressure that didn't belong indoors. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft groan of the wind against the siding made them flinch. Even the generator's hum sounded nervous. By dawn, a faint pale light seeped through the curtains. Frank was the first to step into the kitchen, bracing himself before pulling back the blinds. He didn't call for Martha, but she heard the sharp inhale and came running. The snowmen were closer again. This time there was no denying it. They stood only a few yards from the porch steps, lined up as neatly as fence posts. Their forms had grown more defined, too defined. Shoulders angled, neck shapes emerging beneath crusted frost, their faces clearer, disturbingly human in proportion. But the worst part wasn't them. It was the shed. The old wooden door, always creaky and stiff from decades of winters, now hung open several inches. Snow drifted across the threshold as if something large had pushed its way inside. "Did you leave it open?" Martha whispered. Frank shook his head. "You know that door sticks. It takes a hard pull to move it." Hannah appeared behind them, rubbing her eyes. When she saw the shed, she grabbed Martha's arm. Inside the shed, buried under lawn equipment and old tarps, was where Frank kept winter gear, tools, and more troubling now, old coats and boots from years past. Heavy, thick ones, human-shaped ones. He bundled up and stepped outside despite the bitter cold, following the fresh disturbance around the building. There were no footprints, no animal tracks, only long, smooth grooves in the snow, like weight had dragged rather than stepped. He pushed the shed door open. Inside, it was a mess. Boxes shoved aside, tarps torn, piles of old clothing strewn across the floor. One parka lay in a corner, ripped open as if something had clawed or yanked it apart. Frost coated the interior wall in long streaks, like fingers drawn through condensation. He backed out slowly, heart hammering. When he returned to the house, he didn't speak. He just locked the door and pulled the curtains tight. By afternoon, the silence outside grew unnatural. No birds, no shifting branches, no distant hum of a plow truck. The world felt paused. At sunset, The lights flickered again. This time they stayed dim, humming low like a warning. Martha couldn't resist a glance out the window. The snowmen hadn't moved positions, but their heads had tilted. All three, slightly, perfectly aligned, watching the house with faces that were no longer vague shapes, but recognizable forms. Mr. Turner, Mrs. Daly, and the first one, tall, wrong, faceless, but taking shape too quickly. That night, the Carters didn't just fear movement. They feared what would happen when the snowmen finally finished becoming whatever they were trying to be. By the seventh morning, the house felt less like a home and more like a fragile shell pressed between cold hands. Martha barely recognized her own reflection, pale, sleepless, waiting for something she couldn't name but felt approaching. Frank stood at the window with a tight jaw. The snowmen were at the base of the porch now, no more than a single leap away. Their forms were almost perfect, faces sculpted with terrifying accuracy, skin-like contours beneath thin ice. Mr. Turner's recognizable frown, Mrs. Daly's rounded cheeks, and the first one, tall, faceless no longer, now carried the vague features of another missing resident, one whose disappearance hadn't even made the news yet. Hannah cried softly, "They're almost here." Frank made a decision then, sharp, immediate, full of desperation. "We're leaving, now." He grabbed the car keys from the hook and gestured for everyone to move. Coats on, boots laced, bags thrown together in minutes. Martha clutched Hannah's hand, practically dragging her toward the front door. The moment Frank opened it, frigid air flooded inside. And something else. A sound. A faint, wet crackling, like branches shifting or something heavy adjusting its weight. The snowmen did not move, but they were too close to see fully without stepping outside. Their presence hung in the air like breath on glass. Frank led the way to the truck. The driveway was buried deep, but the tires were built for bad winters. He climbed in, slammed the door, and turned the key. Nothing. He tried again. The engine clicked, coughed, then silence. Martha's voice trembled. "Frank, what is it?" He yanked open the hood. The cold bit at his fingers instantly, but the moment he looked inside, he staggered back. The wires weren't chewed. They weren't snapped. They were cleanly severed, as if sliced by something sharp and deliberate, as if someone or something had reached inside from below. He slammed the hood and looked around wildly. The yard was still, the sky pale, the snowmen motionless. But he could feel it. They weren't statues. They were waiting. He ushered everyone back inside, locking the door with shaking hands. For hours, the family sat together in the living room, wrapped in blankets, listening to the eerie quiet outside. The snowmen did not advance again that day, but as dusk bled into the yard, shadows stretching long and thin, their heads slowly, almost imperceptibly, tilted upward, toward the windows, toward the light, toward the family trapped inside. And not one of them looked like mere snow anymore. By the eighth morning, a thin mist clung to the ground, blurring the yard in a way that made depth hard to judge. The snowmen stood frozen in their impossible closeness, but something about them looked off. Their surfaces had begun to crack. thin fractures traced across their torsos like veins of glass. A soft breeze carried faint, brittle sounds, tiny snaps, tiny shifts, like ice settling inside a hollow shell. Martha was the first to notice the change. "Frank, look at the middle one." He leaned closer to the window. Mrs. Daly's likeness, the third figure, had a split running down one side of its face. Beneath the snow, where solid ice should have been, was dark emptiness, a hollow interior. No body, no frozen remains, just a shell trying to hold shape. Frank turned away, shaken. "They aren't corpses. They're copies." Hannah whispered. "Copies of who they took." The words hung in the air like a cold draught. That afternoon the mist thickened. Light dimmed early, muting the world to gray-blue. At one point, a soft clatter echoed outside, gentle but unmistakable. Martha peeked out the window and froze. One of the figures, the tall one, had collapsed. Not from being knocked over, it had simply fallen inward, like something had once filled it, then stepped out. Its empty shell lay scattered across the snow in jagged, icy chunks. But no footprints led away from its remains. No trails, nothing disturbed the untouched surface. Only a new wrongness, the sense that something unseen had slithered free. By dusk, the other two snowmen were cracking too. Their faces sagged, their shoulders caving slightly, as frost detached from whatever shapes it had been molded around. Frank said what none of them wanted to voice. "They don't need the shells anymore." The generator lights flickered again, long enough for Martha to grab Frank's arm, long enough for Hannah to gasp, long enough for them to hear a sound from the back of the house. A slow, dragging scrape across the floorboards of the mudroom. Then silence. Frank grabbed a flashlight, moving toward the hall, but the beam trembled in his hand. As he stepped forward, the scraping resumed. Softer now, like something adjusting its weight, testing the contour of its new shape. The family backed together toward the center of the living room. Outside, through the dimming light, Martha saw that the two remaining snowmen were no longer facing the house. They were turned away, as if whatever had been inside them was now somewhere else.
Night settled early, swallowing what little light the mist had left. The house felt smaller than ever, its walls too thin, its corners too dark. The snowmen outside remained turned away, abandoned shells stiffening in the cold. Whatever had been inside them was now loose. A soft tapping echoed from the mudroom, not frantic, measured, testing, as if something unfamiliar with motion was learning how to navigate solid floors. Frank whispered, "Stay behind me," though his voice barely rose above breath. He stepped toward the hallway, flashlight trembling, its beam slicing thinly through the dark. Each step was careful, controlled, until a sudden creak came from inside the wall itself. A dry, sliding sound, too smooth to be settling wood. Martha grabbed Hannah and backed into the living room. The tapping stopped. Then, Faintly, the wall by the pantry bulged outward, just for a second, like something pressed from the other side and then withdrew, leaving a faint crack in the paint. Hannah whimpered, "It's inside the walls." Frank shined the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam flickered as if the air itself warped. For a moment, the light passed through something that wasn't fully there. A vague outline, tall and thin, shimmering with frost before dissolving. He stumbled back. "They're not using bodies anymore. They're using spaces." Martha tugged him away as a low groaning noise vibrated through the floorboards, like pressure shifting beneath the house. The lights dimmed again. A cold drift of air seeped from the hallway, carrying the faint, damp smell of thawing snow. Something slid across the kitchen tiles. Very slow, very heavy. Frank moved toward the back door. "We need to get out. We'll make a run for the barn and block it off until morning." But when he pulled back the curtain, Martha gasped. The snowmen outside weren't shells anymore. They had collapsed completely, scattered into pieces, and those scattered pieces, chunks of ice, snow, and frost, had arranged themselves in thin trails, leading toward the house, toward the foundation, as if they had seeped through cracks, reassembling on the inside. Suddenly the scraping sound came again, this time from the ceiling above them. Then the heating vents rattled, not from airflow, but from something moving through them, dragging icy weight along metal. Martha whispered, "They're learning how to fit." The ceiling creaked. A sigh of cold air fell over them, and then, from inside the vent above the living room, something exhaled, a hollow, freezing breath that didn't belong to any human lungs. They weren't just inside the walls. They were everywhere.
The house didn't scream or shudder when it happened. It simply went quiet. A deep, unnatural quiet, like the moment before a heavy snowfall, when the world holds its breath. The shapes in the vents ceased their drying, the bulges in the walls stilled. Even the cold stopped drifting under the doors. For a moment, the Carters dared to hope that whatever had seeped in had seeped back out. Frank whispered, "Stay here," and stepped toward the hallway. But the house had already changed. The air carried a new scent, faint earth, wet bark, and something sharp beneath it, like metal touched by frost. The floorboards under Frank's boots didn't creak, they flexed, as if remembering weight. Martha pulled Hannah close. "Frank, come back." He didn't get the chance. A hiss of cold erupted from the heating vent behind him, not air, but shape, expanding outward like breath made physical. Frank staggered back, covering his face, but the cold passed over him without touching skin, because it wasn't reaching for him, it was practicing. The cold contracted, withdrew, moved again, this time racing along the ceiling, tracing beams, studying the way space echoed beneath its weight. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The house fell silent once more. Hannah whispered, trembling, "Mom, it's learning us." Martha grabbed Frank's hand. "We're leaving. Windows, door, I don't care how." They rushed out the front door, snow spraying under their boots. The yard was still, the air brittle. Nothing chased them, nothing blocked their path. It was almost merciful. Almost. But when they reached the road, the world shifted. Across the fields, across every yard of every nearby home, snowmen stood in rows, dozens, maybe hundreds, some half-formed, some nearly perfect, some unmistakably shaped like people who still lived nearby. Copies, tests, drafts. And at the very front, closest to the Carters, 4 new figures. Not shells, not cracked, perfect. Faces sculpted with gentle detail, expressions captured mid-thought. Frank, Martha, Hannah, and one more, an infant version of the family's son who died years ago, a child the creatures could never have seen. Martha fell to her knees, because these weren't threats, they weren't warnings, they were replacements. A soft wind rose, swirling powder around the figures. The snow forms shimmered, their outlines flickering like reflections in shallow water. Then, from the fields behind them, movement rippled, gentle, gliding, silent. Not bodies, not monsters, just cold, learning how to wear a face. Frank whispered, horrified, "They don't want to kill us." Hannah clutched his arm. "Then what do they want?" The wind answered for them, lifting a shift of frost off the nearest snowman, revealing beneath the outer layer a smooth, featureless surface waiting to be shaped. Martha finally understood. They want to become us. And as the family backed away down the frozen road, the rows of figures all turned their heads, not abruptly, not violently, but with slow, practiced precision, perfectly synchronized, perfectly human. The Carters fled into the dark, into the storm that was already building again. And by dawn, the town awoke to find 4 new snowmen standing peacefully in the Carters' yard, smiling faintly, faces exact, poses gentle, as if the family had never left at all.